Thomas Coke has been called the Apostle of Methodism and the father of Methodist missions. John Wesley called him the Flea because he traveled around so much. Thomas Coke was one of the first two bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States, along with Francis Asbury, who we talked about in episode 11. During his lifetime, Thomas Coke set up the General Conference, the Book of Discipline, and the Trust Clause, which states that property is not held by the local congregations, but by the denomination. He traveled to America 9 times, and his love for missions is what helped make the church global. So join us today on this episode of the Methodical Methodist podcast as we explore the life and ministry of Thomas Coke. Hello and welcome to the Methodical Methodist podcast, a podcast where we talk about why the church is still relevant for us today as we explore themes connected to religion, politics, pop culture, faith, and yes, even the church. Together, we can find out what it means to live into the mission of the church by making disciples. Now, let's get methodical. Hello, everyone. I am your host, the Reverend Andrew Lay, and I'm excited to spend this time on the podcast today. If you like the show, I hope that you might take a minute to subscribe, rate, and write a review for the podcast. It helps to boost the show and make it to where more people can find it. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/methodicalpod, and you can find me on Instagram as well at methodicalpod. So be sure to check me out. All right, so let's jump into today's episode. Okay, so I'm excited for this one. I feel like Thomas Coke kind of got a bad rap in the Asbury episode, so I'm hoping this episode will help us sympathize a little bit more with Coke. So today we get a chance to see things kind of from a different perspective. Thomas Coke was born in Brecon, Wales on September 28, 1747, as the third and only surviving son of Bartholomew and Anne Phillips Coke. 6 months before Thomas was born, the couple buried their 3-year-old firstborn son, who was named after Bartholomew. Their second son had only lived a few days. Bartholomew was an apothecary, which is kind of like an old-timey pharmacist. And apparently he gained a reputation for his medical skill. In fact, Thomas had these words engraved on his father's memorial tablet. His great medical knowledge was well known in this country, so that very rarely did anyone under his care employ a physician. Thomas had a very happy childhood. He grew up in the richest town in Wales at the time. He was described as a bit of a lad with an eye for the girls, whose enjoyment of high life was likely to shock no one who had not entirely forgotten the days of his own youth. He was a warm-hearted, friendly person, witty in conversation. His broad features made him attractive by the eager eyes and ready smile, despite a stocky figure that was later to turn to portliness. In fact, Thomas was only about 5 feet and 1 inch tall. Thomas loved both of his parents, and he gained an interest in medicine because of the influence of his father, but Bartholomew passed away in 1773. During this time, Thomas was still a priest in the Church of England. This is before he had switched over to the Methodist Church, which may have actually been a good thing considering his father was a staunch Church of England man. His mother Anne, however, was alive when he became a part of the Methodist Church, and she had really no problem with it. On April 6, 1764, Thomas Coke entered Jesus College in Oxford University as a gentleman commoner at the age of 16. And for those of you who don't know, a gentleman commoner is basically anyone who comes from a privileged class of commoners that is required to pay higher fees than ordinary commoners at the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge. So Coke attended Oxford over 40 years after John Wesley had started attending there in 1720. He earned a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and a doctorate in civil law while studying at Oxford. Then in 1768, Coke became a fellow commoner at 21. And during this time, he was also elected Burgess of the Borough, which is like the representative of a borough or an area in England. And he was also elected as a member of the Common Council in his hometown. And then a few years later, at the age of 23, he was elected bailiff, which basically was like the mayor. So he was extremely accomplished, especially at such a young age. Thomas Coke was ordained as a deacon on Trinity Sunday, 1770, by the Bishop of Oxford and the Cathedral Church of Christ. And 2 years later, on Sunday, August the 23rd, 1772, he was ordained as a priest by the Bishop of St. David's in the chapel of St. John the Baptist. In July 1771, he was appointed as the assistant priest under the Reverend Robert Twyford in the small town of South Petherton in the district of Somerset, England. At the time of Coke, South Petherton was a town of around 1,500 people. And historically, South Petherton was a market town, but now it's regarded to be a small town. But there is no doubt that Thomas Coke kept very busy in this time, in this very, at the time, active town. By the following July, Coke had resigned from his mayoral duties back in his hometown because he was obviously living elsewhere. A few years into serving this appointment, though, the senior priest, Robert Twyford, became very ill, and so Coke took up the main priestly responsibilities and was, for all intents and purposes, basically the senior priest, at least until the death of Twyford in 1776, when they appointed a new vicar to replace Twyford. Coke took his responsibilities very seriously. He spent hours writing sermons and often stayed up late into the night working on those sermons. He read devotional materials and books, and during this time he was introduced to the writings of a Methodist leader, John Fletcher, and also John Wesley. The writings of Fletcher was, he said, the blessed means of bringing me among that despised people called Methodists, with whom, God being my helper, I'm determined to live and die. Coke, who was once a staunch Anglican and had absolutely no Methodist leanings whatsoever, was now becoming more and more interested about these people called Methodists. He began hearing Methodists preach and started rubbing shoulders with some Methodist class leaders. And during this time, Coke was walking to a service one evening at a church outside his parish, and he prayed earnestly for a blessing. And then later, he felt God speak peace into his soul, dispel all his fears, and fill his heart with an unspeakable joy. And this moment has been labeled Coke's conversion experience. This was the very moment when Coke said he received an instantaneous assurance of the pardon of sin. Of course, as you might imagine, some of his parishioners back in his Church of England parish were upset with Coke and his Methodist leanings. In fact, one of his biggest opponents wrote in print that his embracing the dark and erroneous doctrines of Methodism was chiefly the result of disappointed hopes of preferment in the church. Coke had received his doctorate in civil law at Oxford by this time, but he was not able to achieve this preferment in the Anglican Church, and that essentially was the process where a priest moves to a higher role, such as a canon, archdeacon, dean, or bishop. And in this quote, this opponent, John Thomas, was rubbing it in Coke's face. Then, on August 13th, 1776, Thomas Coke rode over to Kingston St. Mary in order to meet with John Wesley. John had preached in Taunton and was spending the night at James Brown's house, not to be confused with the singer. And Coke and Wesley sat around the table that evening at Brown's house, and early the next morning they continued their talk and walked outside in the garden next to Brown's home. John Wesley encouraged Coke to do all the good he could, visit from house to house, omit no part of his clerical duty, and to avoid every reasonable ground of offense. Some good, solid priestly advice. Coke was a bit disappointed because he was actually hoping that Wesley might offer him employment and invite him to travel alongside him. Coke complained that he was, quote, still confined, still to the work of a parish. Coke returned to his church in the hopes of turning it into a Methodist parish. And again, at this time, Methodism was a movement within the Church of England, but not a lot of people were embracing that movement inside the church. And so Coke created enough opposition in his church that he was eventually dismissed as their pastor on, get this, Easter Sunday, 1777. I kid you not. The congregation celebrated by ringing the church bells, hearing a sermon from their new preacher, talking about the faults of their old preacher, and drinking cider in the street. So that is a pretty nice farewell for Thomas Coke. It's said that after this expulsion from the church, he went to John Wesley and asked, "What do I do now that I have no parish and no church?" And John Wesley simply replied, "Why, go and preach the gospel to all the world." And as you will see by the end of this episode, no words were ever taken more literally, because that's exactly what Thomas Coke did. By June 1777, though, Coke had joined Wesley, and the two traveled on a preaching tour that eventually brought them to South Wales. And on one occasion, while Coke was traveling from Bristol to London, one of his fellow passengers got very ill in the stagecoach. And Coke went to fetch some water from a nearby stream, but then he realized that the only thing that he had to carry the water with was his brand new clergy cassock. And so he returned empty-handed. And another man who was assisting the sick passenger said, "What, sir, have you brought no water?" And then just immediately ran off and returned with his hat full of water. And Coke was rebuked by this man for his behavior. Still, Coke began to dive into the Methodist movement head first. Coke preached at the Foundry, at West Street Chapel, and the new chapel in City Road. But he also engaged, like John and Charles, in open-air preaching, and he became a very popular preacher. Apparently, he was very enthusiastic and animated in his preaching style, and between 1778 and 1783, Coke pretty much remained in London, and during this time, Wesley came to know him as, quote, sound in the faith and zealous of good works. It seemed that Wesley had finally found the assistant that he had been searching for. Coke was admitted to the most secret councils, and John confided some very important things in Coke. Over the span of several years, Coke served Wesley as his secretary and his personal representative to the various Methodist societies. Wesley valued his legal mind, and he found him to be a gifted evangelical preacher, a skilled administrator, and his most trusted companion. In 1780, Coke served as superintendent of Methodism's London circuit, and then in 1782, Coke served as the first chairman of the Irish Conference. By the year 1784, it was a very momentous year for Coke. Wesley was at the age of 81, and he made the decision to ordain Methodist preachers. Initially, he did this in order to try to maintain some control over American Methodism and to kind of try to keep the American movement within the Anglican tradition. And so Wesley ordained Richard Watcote and Thomas Vassey as deacons and then elders, which is equivalent of an ordained priest. And then he ordained Thomas Coke, who was already ordained as a priest in the Church of England, but he ordained him as a superintendent. And he made plans for Coke to ordain Asbury as a superintendent as well once he arrived in America. On Thursday, September 2nd, 1784, at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the home of Dr. John Castleman, John Wesley placed hands on Thomas Coke and offered a prayer to set apart Thomas Coke as a superintendent of the rapidly growing Methodist movement in America. Coke was tasked with traveling to America to lay hands upon Francis Asbury in order to appoint him as a joint superintendent with him in the United States. After John Wesley commissioned Thomas Coke, the two men stood at the pier, and as the boat departed, Wesley said to Coke, "Offer them Christ, Thomas." And this parting word of encouragement helped to prepare him for the task he would take on in this new role. In November 1784, Asbury and Coke met with a few other preachers at Barrett's Chapel, just south of Dover, Delaware, and they decided to call a general conference in Baltimore. The Christmas Conference of 1784 then took place on Christmas Eve at Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore, Maryland. During this special Christmas conference, 65 of the 85 active itinerant preachers voted unanimously to create an independent church that was free of its connection to the Church of England. They also elected Coke and Asbury to serve as the superintendents of this new body. During this conference, on the first day, Thomas Coke ordained Asbury as a deacon, then the next day as an elder, and then the day after that as a superintendent. And then Coke preached a sermon on Revelation 3, 7 through 11 to mark this special occasion. The American Methodist connection had now transformed into the Methodist Episcopal Church. Thomas quickly began to familiarize himself with the American landscape, and he soon became aware of the dangers that face Methodist circuit riding preachers. He writes about one occasion while traveling south from Alexandria, Virginia. "I found that I had two streams to pass. The first I went over without much danger, but in crossing the second, which was very strong and very deep, I did not observe that a tree brought down by the flood lay across the landing place. I endeavored, but in vain, to drive my horse against the stream and go around the tree. I was afraid to turn my horse's head to the stream and afraid to go back. In this dilemma, I thought it most prudent for me to lay hold on the tree and go over it, the water being shallow on the other side of the tree. But I did not advert to the danger of loosening the tree from its hold. For no sooner did I execute my purpose so far as to lay hold of the tree, and that instant the horse was carried from under me. But the motion that I gave it loosened it, and down the stream it instantly carried me. Some distance off there grew a tree in the middle of the stream, the root of which had formed a little bank or island and divided the stream. And here the tree which I held was stopped. Instantly there came down with the flood a large branch of a tree upon my back, which was so heavy that I was afraid it would break my back. I was now jammed up for a considerable time. A few minutes appeared long at such a season, expecting that my strength would soon be exhausted and I should drop between the tree and the branch. It was an awful time. However, through the blessing of my almighty preserver, to whom all be the glory, I at last got my knee, which I long endeavored at in vain, on the tree which I grasped, and then soon disengaged myself and climbed up the little bank. Here I panted for breath for some time, and when I recovered, perceiving the water between the little island and the shore not to be very deep or very strong, I ventured through it and got to land. I was now obliged to walk about a mile, shivering, before I came to a house. That night I lay on a bed on the ground, and my strength having been so exhausted, slept soundly all the night. Thus I was wonderfully preserved, and I trust I shall never forget so awful, but a very instructive, a scene. While traveling through the American landscape, not only did Thomas Coke come to learn about the dangers of the wilderness, but he also became keenly aware of the evils of slavery. The Conference of 1780 had passed a resolution condemning slavery as contrary to the laws of God, man, and nature, hurtful to society, and contrary to the dictates of conscience and pure religion. However, the sin of slavery, unfortunately, was still very alive in the South. Together, Coke and Asbury advocated for the emancipation of slaves, and they were very vocal about the evils of slavery. On May 26th, Coke and Asbury visited with George Washington at Mount Vernon to discuss the issue of slavery. In his journal, Coke writes about this experience, saying, "The general's seat is very elegant, built upon the great river Potomac. He received us very politely and was very open to access. He is quite the plain country gentleman, and he is a friend to mankind. After dinner, we desired a private interview and opened to him the grand business on which we came, presenting to him our petition for the emancipation of slaves, and entreating his signature if the eminence of his station did not render it expedient for him to sign any petition. He informed us that he was of our sentiments, and had signified his thoughts on the subject to most of the great men of the state, that he did not see it proper to sign the petition, but if the assembly took it into consideration, would signify his sentiments to the assembly by a letter. He asked us to spend the evening and lodge at his house, but our engagement at Annapolis the following day would not admit of it. I was loth to leave him, and I greatly love and esteem him, and if there was no pride in it, I would say that we are kindred spirits, formed of the same mold. Oh, that God would give him the witness of his Spirit." So essentially, they made this appeal to George Washington, asked him to sign this document, but in the end, although George Washington agreed with their sentiments, chose not to sign their document. But even still, Coke and Asbury made a stand against slavery. They threatened slaveholders with excommunication and presented this anti-slavery petition to George Washington at Mount Vernon. But in the end, Coke and Asbury had very little success in their efforts to eradicate slavery. Another project that Coke and Asbury joined together on was the formation of a Methodist college, which was named Cokesbury College. Unfortunately, the college burned down, and then it was rebuilt, but then it burned down a second time, and unfortunately, that was the end of the college. It had always kind of struggled. It had always caused a lot of financial difficulties and problems, and so in the end, when the college burned down the second time, they just decided it really wasn't worth their trouble. Coke decided to travel back to England, and he did this many times. He'd come kind of back and forth between England and America, and we see later that he goes to many other places as well in between those times. But he goes back to England, and he arrives back just in time for the Conference of 1785. Coke had arrived to a Methodist connection that was in the midst of conflict. John had ordained Coke, and people started taking sides on that matter. Many folks agree with Charles Wesley, John's brother, who was adamantly against John ordaining Methodist preachers outside of the Church of England. And a lot of animosity was directed toward Coke. For example, Charles Wesley wrote a cutting hymn against Coke, which said, "A Roman emperor, 'tis said, his favorite horse a council made. But Coke brings greater things to pass. He made a bishop of an ass." Despite the tension in British Methodism, John Wesley ended up ordaining 3 more lay preachers to administer the sacraments in the Conference of 1785. So John Wesley just kind of doubles down on this. And Coke soon found himself conflicted, living in 2 worlds. John Wesley could not completely spare him to permanently stay in America, so Coke spent a lot of time, again, traveling back and forth, and this is what earned him the nickname, the Flea. He traveled to America every 2 years, and he would spend the early months of 1787, 1789, and 1791 visiting in the American societies and attending annual conferences as he traveled. On the way between England and America, Coke would often stop and visit in the West Indies on the way. All of his work also earned him another nickname, which was the Father of Methodist Missions. In 1786, he authored a pamphlet entitled An Address to the Pious and Benevolent proposing an annual subscription for the support of missionaries, which was the first Methodist missionary tract. He had originally intended to establish missionaries in Nova Scotia, but a gale force wind caused him to land in Antigua, West Indies instead. And Coke found some incredible opportunities in the West Indies. The British colonies stationed there allowed him to find good connections, and this missionary effort became an important passion throughout his entire life. So we see that Coke was constantly traveling around. But on one visit to America, Coke brought some news with him from John Wesley in England, and he brought that news to Asbury, saying that Asbury was ordered by Wesley to appoint Richard Watcote a joint superintendent along with him. And Asbury and the other Methodist preachers in America bucked back against Wesley's attempt to try to maintain control of American Methodism. This was perhaps also Wesley's attempt to try to backtrack. He never intended for the American movement to form into this new church. But it was really too late, because the American Methodists had already just formed this new church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and they believed that they should have the authority to appoint their own superintendents. Coke was pressuring American Methodists to follow Wesley's orders, but the preachers were resistant, and this of course created tension and animosity between Asbury and Coke. And in the end, the American Conference decided not to ordain Richard Watcote as a joint superintendent. Ultimately, this event helped to solidify and strengthen Asbury's authority as a leader of the Methodist Church. Asbury was also upset because he was expected to adjust his own schedule to meet the needs of Coke. Asbury writes about this in his journal, saying, "The arrangement of these conferences as to time and place to be fitted to the doctor's, or Coke's, movings was the only cause of swelling of old Daddy Wesley and me. I have been prevented from visiting some circuits that have been formed 3 or 4 years that have wanted my pastoral care. And as we are now fitted to meet the doctor's coming, I can only see them once in 2 years, whereas if I was wholly at my own disposal, I should see them all in the space of 12 or 15 months." In the end, we see that Asbury eventually gets his way on this matter. Coke, however, has failed to maintain authority in American Methodism, and perhaps this is due to his constant travel schedule and his conflicting allegiance between England and America. He was trying to support John Wesley, who he had been so close to, and he had served as his secretary, but he was also trying to kind of do right by the American Methodists as well. It was a very, I think, difficult spot to be in, but in the end, it just wasn't enough. Asbury insisted on Episcopal authority, and Coke had just failed to do the same. Coke, along with another rogue preacher named James O'Kelly, then began to conspire behind Asbury's back. Asbury had formed a Methodist council to oversee the expansive church and make decisions on behalf of the overall church, and O'Kelly disagreed with this model, and Thomas Coke sided with O'Kelly. But little did O'Kelly know that Coke had ulterior motives. He only sided with O'Kelly in an effort to weaken Asbury's episcopal status. And ultimately, Coke really hoped to cause a renewed relationship with the Anglican Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church. I get the sense that Coke was mainly motivated out of this for his love for Wesley. He may have seen the writing on the wall that Wesley was drawing closer to death, And he wanted to try to bring some reconciliation between this kind of rogue American Methodist Episcopal Church and bring it back into the fold, because in England it was still a part of the Church of England. But the writing was on the wall, and inevitably Wesley did pass away. On April 28th, 1791, Coke's plans came crashing to the ground. While Coke and Asbury were traveling through Virginia, they learned of John Wesley's death, and Coke decided to return back to England. But first, Coke preached memorial services for John Wesley in Baltimore and Philadelphia, using 2 Kings 2:12, which is on the passing of Elijah. And many people actually believe that he was suggesting that Wesley represented Elijah, and Coke himself represented Elisha, the prophet who was his successor. And so here we might see a bit of Coke's ambition come out. I think he really did see himself as the obvious choice to be Wesley's successor. After all, he had been Wesley's right-hand man. So Coke left for England and hoped to win the election of the president of the European Methodists. And ultimately, he was not chosen. Instead, a man named William Thompson was elected to serve in this role. However, Coke did end up serving as William Thompson's secretary, and he continued to fill this role for many years. And in addition, it should be noted that Coke did later serve as the president of the European Methodists briefly in 1797 and again in 1805. But still, Coke managed to meet with Bishop William White in America to go over his plans to unite the Methodist Church in America back alongside with the Church of England. Ultimately, Coke's plan failed miserably. In the following years, Coke would travel back and forth between America and England even more. After this, Coke and Asbury's relationship, as you can imagine, was quite strained, although they were eventually able to move past their differences. But during this time, things were pretty rough between the two bishops, and Coke was arguing that Asbury had figuratively stabbed Wesley in the back and had literally hastened his death. And because of that, Asbury was worthy of eternal damnation. The American Methodists eventually called for Coke to sign a letter declaring his partial abdication. In other words, he signed this document that limited his authority as an Episcopal leader. And he was only able to assume ultimate authority in American Methodism in the event of Asbury's death. But then he further agreed that in the event of Asbury's death, that his authority over American Methodism should actually revert to the preachers in the conference. And so he essentially gave up all of his authority. In future visits to America, Coke was simply addressed as plain Dr. Coke. Despite their differences, Asbury was saddened to see this happen. In fact, Asbury noted that it was like a death to him. However, Coke still remained instrumental in the Methodist movement. On his fifth journey to the States, in 1792, Coke arrived in Baltimore for the Methodist Conference. Asbury was very ill during this time, and he was happy to turn the chair over to Coke. Coke preached the conference sermon, Witness of the Spirit. He also prepared a new edition of the Discipline and organized the Methodist Episcopal Church into 6 districts, which were each under the jurisdiction of an annual conference. And then Coke and Asbury worked together on producing an annotated edition of the Book of Discipline. So it sounds like it was a very productive year, although Coke did not stay in America for very long. Still, Coke found that his engagement with the American connection was irrevocable. The English Conference in 1797 elected Coke to the presidential chair and wrote a letter to the American Connection asking them to release Coke of his obligations because he was needed in England. Coke actually traveled to America to deliver this letter himself. But this is actually crazy. His ship on the way was captured by a French privateer, and all the passengers lost all of their possessions. And it was just a stroke of luck that Coke was allowed to board another vessel going to America instead of being taken to Puerto Rico, which is just kind of a crazy little background story. But Coke did safely make it to America. And he was very conflicted. He knew that he essentially had no authority or power in American Methodism, but there was a part of him that really still loved America and loved the people there and loved the cause. In one letter he wrote, "I love the cause in America. I saw how wonderfully God owned the work under the present form of things." Ultimately, the American Connection decided it was time for Coke to officially return back to England, and so Coke left the New World for the 9th and last time. Less than 1 year after his return from America, Thomas Coke, who was now 57 years old, married Miss Penelope Golding Smith in the spring of 1805. Penelope was the daughter of a well-to-do solicitor, and she had inherited a substantial fortune. Penelope and Coke had originally met after she had pledged financial support for missions for Coke. But I really don't get the impression that she was just a sugar mama who was providing financial support for Coke. I think he really did love her. In fact, in one letter he writes, "Oh, my love, I do love you with an ardent, increasing, unabated, and never diminishing love. And it is a great addition to my happiness that I am fully assured that we shall be with each other and love each other to all eternity." On their honeymoon, they traveled from Clifton to Bath. Then they went to an inn called Old Down, and then the next day they made their way to Plymouth Dock. In fact, in the first 6 weeks of their married life, they covered over 400 miles. This is an indication of what married life would be like with Coke. Rather than Coke traveling on his own, Penelope often traveled with him on his missionary journeys. Coke even said, "We are always traveling, and I annually visit and preach at more places than I did for many years before my marriage." But many scholars believe that this marriage is what actually prevented Coke from ever returning to America. When Asbury learned of Coke's marriage, he responded, "Marriage is honorable and all, but to me, it is a ceremony as awful as death." So you get the impression that Asbury never really thought of marriage in his own life. But for all his failings in American Methodism, which they were numerous, Thomas Coke more than makes up for it in his accomplishments in various other missionary efforts. As one author by the name of Cyril Davies says, "No man in Methodism has a greater significance for his own age, for Methodism, and for the missionary movement. No man deserving to be remembered has more completely been forgotten." Methodism was one of the first of the Protestant denominations to engage in overseas missions, and this was really due to Thomas Coke. In less than 9 years, Coke was able to expand Methodism in the Caribbean for one single society of 2,000 people to a membership of 6,570 people. He had helped form 12 new missionaries working in 10 of the islands, and throughout the rest of his life, Coke supervised this work. By 1814, there were 12 circuits throughout the Caribbean with a membership of 17,000 people. And Thomas Coke deserves most of the credit for this. Not enough is said about his success in his mission work. Coke sent pioneer missionaries not only to the islands in the West Indies, but he also sent them to new missions in Sierra Leone, Nova Scotia, Ireland, and France. He even organized work among 70,000 French prisoners of war being held in England during the Napoleonic Wars. At John Wesley's last conference before he died in 1790, Wesley named Coke to head the first Methodist Missionary Committee. In reference to his work in this committee, Coke said, "I beg from door to door." He unabashedly even donated his family's wealth to the missionary effort. In 1811, Coke's wife Penelope, however, passed away, leaving Coke in a state of sadness and depression. Coke wrote, "The unspeakable loss I have felt has quite unhinged my whole soul. I have hardly been able to put pen to paper. I was obliged to fly from myself. I have traveled about 1,500 miles in about 10 weeks, but all nature has lost its beauty." Coke did marry again, however, Before the year had ended, actually, Coke married Anne Loxdale. She was 55 years old, and in regard to this marriage, Coke wrote, "I could fill a quire of paper with love and praises from my very dear wife. God himself has brought her to me, or me to her, by a series of wonderful providences, and I verily believe by the direction of my Penelope." The newlywed couple wasted no time in traveling around together in missionary efforts. However, on December 5th, 1812, Anne Coke passed away within a few days of their first wedding anniversary. Again, Coke found himself grieving over the loss of another beloved spouse. But Coke would only live a few years after this loss himself. Coke died in 1814 on board a ship traveling to India. Coke was leading a missionary band of preachers for India and South Africa. Early in the morning, on May 3rd at about 5 o'clock in the morning, Coke was found on the cabin floor. Some suggest that Coke died from a possible stroke. When the news of his death reached Asbury, he spoke of Coke as the greatest man of all the Oxonian Methodists and the greatest man in the last century. The funeral took place at 5 o'clock that afternoon, and his body was released into the bottom of the Indian Ocean. One biographer suggests that this was fitting, considering this man had spent so much time as a homeless traveler, sailing from place to spread the gospel. When learning of his death, one dear friend named Joseph Entwistle wrote, "God's thoughts are not our thoughts, nor his ways our ways. We must still say, the Lord doth all things well. He buries his workmen and carries on his work." So I hope you have enjoyed this journey into the life of Thomas Coke, the apostle of Methodism and the father of Methodist missions. I think we can see that Coke was a flawed individual, but he was still able to do some truly amazing things to further the Methodist movement and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, I hope you might consider heading on over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review of the show. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, stay methodical.